Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm your host, Liz Lang. Each week on this podcast, we will break down various aspects of mental health. We are so excited you're here and hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Jeremiah and Selena Woodruff, and this week we are going to get into teaching your children about sexuality. So, as this title implies, we are going to be talking about what I guess you could call adult topics. I kind of disagree with that misnomer because I think sexuality is something that can and does start at a young age and something you should be discussing at a young age. But we are going to be talking about mature topics and sexuality. As always on this podcast, we will be professional. We will use clinical and proper terms. So this is a really important topic, and it's been a while since we've hit on this one. I've done it before with Lindy, and so I'm really excited to get a different perspective with Jeremiah and Selena on this one. And it's interesting because of the culture around sex. And on the one hand, it's everywhere, and it feels like it's constantly shoved in your face. But I feel like it's also something that is sometimes not talked about enough appropriately. So youth today, they get a really garbled or a almost very distorted version of what real sexuality is like and a real healthy sexual relationship is like. So we're going to break that down. We're going to give you some good tips for kids of all ages and kind of when it starts and how to have that good dialogue. So I want to start by talking about why parents can sometimes feel uncomfortable about this and acknowledge that can be very valid, can be very awkward. So give me your guys' thoughts on this, on why this is kind of a common occurrence.
Yeah, so it's kind of a taboo topic, right? Even in relationships, we find that couples struggle to talk about their intimate relationship together, which is kind of a fascinating thing. While they experience it together, they don't experience it the same way. And so even having that conversation can be difficult. So it does take practice, and it's pretty normal to feel uncomfortable, talking about those things with your kids. I find that one of the things that really helps is starting at a young age with appropriate conversations. And a young age and appropriate is definitely definable by each individual. And each child is going to need something different. Like we often comment on this podcast about, like, your family is unique. Your family, you have individuals in your family that all have different needs and are at different levels. And so finding that time to start having those conversations, kids will naturally be curious, give them a correct and appropriate information. And that just kind of starts the process.
I think that it's based out of fear. As parents, we fear a couple different things because are we going to say the right thing? Are we going to teach them the right way? Also, it's uncomfortable when our children act uncomfortable, right? So we just want them to feel comfortable. And if they're acting uncomfortable, then it makes us uncomfortable. So I think sometimes it's based out of fear of how it's going to go and am I doing it right? And how your kids are going to take it and just being okay that they are going to be uncomfortable. And also there's kind of a belief that if you teach your kids about sexuality, they're going to be curious and be more sexual younger. But we do know that there's lots of research out there that has proven that to be wrong, and that it actually has proven that the earlier we're open about our communication about sexuality, then our children are equipped with that knowledge and know what to do when they're in those situations with themselves or others.
Right. And because, sexuality, it's something that they are all going to experience. So in some way, as they go through puberty, obviously they're going to experience, girls will experience menstruation, boys will experience their first ejaculation involuntarily, and, just those biological processes that happen to everybody. But they're also likely to encounter it before that at school. And that's kind of where we want to help safeguard our kids and where we want to teach them what we want them to know about sexuality and about healthy sexuality. And you can instill beliefs, and it's very important to pass down your morals and your values to your kids. That's a really important part of parenthood. And You want to be the one to do that, not their friends, because their friends are likely to have different values than you, or they might have different views on sexuality. And so you want to make sure you're giving your kids the information rather than what they're going to hear at school.
Here's what I say to my kids to that. When they come to us with things about sex, or they've heard this, or somebody at school, something, I'm like, I think you need to talk to somebody that has experienced sex, not someone who hasn't even had that opportunity, right? Why are you getting your information from these kids that haven't even experienced it? Let's talk to somebody who you trust in your life, mom and dad, others maybe, that have some experience with that to let you know what's real and not real.
Yeah. And to add to that, I appreciate what you said there, Liz and Selena, but the struggle here is that if we aren't teaching them about their sexuality and who they are, Google will, their friends will, as you guys stated. And that information is, like we're alluding to, is so often incorrect. Whether the morals and standards are the same, it's just not accurate most of the time. And so we want to be able to help them explore their sexuality in a way that's healthy and appropriate and realistic.
Yeah. And whatever that looks like within your family, and hopefully you've kind of had this idea with your, with either your spouse or your parenting partner of what is this going to look like for our kids? What does this look like for our family? What values or what do we want to teach them about this? And then that way you can also be a team about it, or you can be on the same page. So one of the things that can be difficult as children get older is I think the older they get, the more uncomfortable they might start to feel about it. And even if parents do everything right, when I was in high school, I would never have talked to my parents about sex or sexuality. Like it wasn't a topic that was discussed. And, and I'm in no way trying to shame my parents, right? They taught me kind of the basics, and then the rest I basically heard from hearsay. And right. So when that instance happens, I mean, even if you're doing all the right things, your teen may still not want to talk to you about sex, or may still just completely shut down. And if that happens, don't panic or don't put the blame on yourself, but maybe say, hey, what are some other avenues we can go to? Like, what are some options that you can explore? Their doctor is a great resource, or could be a great resource of like, okay, if you have questions about sex, you can talk to a doctor about and get your questions answered about your sexuality. You may need to be careful there if you're concerned about, again, kind of that values thing, but just from a terms of biology and what happens, those kinds of things, a doctor could be a great resource. Or just say, who do you have that you feel like you could talk to about this, that, as Selena said, has experienced sex, right? That you can trust.
Yeah, and it can be challenging, and I promise you, your kids will squirm and wiggle, especially as they enter that adolescent stage and hit puberty. It just seems to get more uncomfortable for them. But if we wait until they're adolescents, we've probably waited too long.
Yeah, but don't lose hope just because you're 15-year-old, you haven't talked to them about sex at this point. It's still okay. You have opportunities. But what I suggest is that you start with relationship with them and that connection that we've talked about previously. You're not just going to come in and have the talk with your child about this, but finding opportunities when you say doing something with them that they like to do and building that relationship with them and building that connection. And then organically, those conversations are going to come up. Asking them, what are they experiencing? What is their world? And seeing what's going on in that time. And those opportunities are going to come up that you're going to be able to have those conversations with them.
So now let's talk about how it does start early. And I think the best way to start early is just being anatomically correct is often the great way to start. So, calling it a penis and a vagina, calling the, breasts, and just normalizing this is our body, and our body is normal. It functions. All parts of it are normal. Another great thing that you can help teach your kids at a young age is the difference between secrecy and privacy. So teaching your kids, my body is private and I get to choose who I show it to, right? So either mom and dad need to look at something, or maybe the doctor needs to look at something, but I get to be in control of who sees my body, because secrecy sometimes can imply shame or there's something wrong or there's something bad about it. Whereas privacy just means I get to be in control of the information, right? So I get to be in control of this. And that can be especially important to talk about at a well child visit. Is a great opportunity to start that discussion, because oftentimes doctors need to look, they need to check genitals to make sure that everything is developing properly and everything looks healthy. And it's a great time to talk to your kid and say, hey, the doctor's going to have to do this. I'm going to be in the room with you. And we're talking like, little kids. And there's only, we don't just do this for everybody. So, those are just great opportunities to start having those conversations and to start helping. And then, you guys can give us, and then Jeremiah and Selena, I'm sure you guys have some great recommendations on kind of age appropriate as things progress, when to have, or kind of what cues to look for in terms of when it's time to kind of bring these conversations. And at least for my experience with my two older kids, it's kind of come up organically. They asked. So, and we talked about it before, but I think my middle daughter, she forgot about it. And so she was 7 years old. She's like, Mom, how did you know how many babies to have? And I'm like, well, Daddy and I decided together. And I'm like, well, she's like, well, how did you guys decide together? And so obviously it led into this conversation of, well, where babies come from and how a baby is made. And I was able to give her age appropriate definitions of how a baby is conceived. And so oftentimes they'll come up organically like that. And so definitely look for situations like that.
Yeah. And I love the way you put that, Liz. And it does come organically when we're having appropriate conversations with our children around our bodies and our reproductive organs, and we're using the proper terms. Age appropriate really just depends on the maturity level of your child, especially these things come up when you have young kids and you're still having children and mom's pregnant. Yep. And, how did that happen? And we can have those conversations. I think that children learn well from books. There are some great books out there that we can use even at a very young age that will show and teach children kind of like, this is what it looks like. This is what happens. This is how babies develop. And, we don't have to go too in depth in details, but just kind of going by that intuition that we have and listening and understanding where each child is valuable. And I'm going to share something here that may be a little bit vulnerable, but, and I don't want to throw my parents under the bus either. Come from a different generation, obviously, and things were different. But I remember asking my dad when my mom was at the hospital having one of my siblings, and I asked him, how did that happen? And, my dad started talking about a period and giving me all kinds of information that I didn't need and I didn't understand at all. Yeah. And I was so confused after that conversation and so uncomfortable that I never spoke to my parents again about it, ever.
Yeah.
And so, while they obviously did the best that they could, and I love them for that, it was not a process at home of open communication. And something else that I find really important is that part of raising your children and teaching them about sexuality is being open with your children in your relationship in a way that's healthy and appropriate. What I mean is your children should see mom and dad kiss and hold hands and embrace and see that there's that physical touch and affection, because that helps them to start to understand what relationship should look like and how that goes. And again, that just leads for opportunity to teach. And, they're going to, oh, gross, mom and dad are kissing, those kinds of things are certainly going to happen. But, that's where we have opportunity to say, but it isn't gross. Yeah. And when we really care about somebody, that's one of the ways that we can show it. And so we just start teaching from that perspective.
So I think that's great. Jeremiah brought up, it's important when our kids come to us to find out what the context of the question is. Another funny story I just listened to today was that a mom was making pizza for dinner, and her 5-year-old came and was like, Mom, what's a virgin? And she was like, oh, I'm ready for this. And she gave her the talk, and she was so proud and like, that went really well. And then her daughter looked at the extra virgin olive oil bottle and said, well, what's extra virgin olive oil then? And so just understanding that the context of the question. We're talking age appropriate, and that can be different for every kid at different ages, right? And so understanding how we react to those questions is important. And so finding out what the context of the question is where you can gauge what they're ready to learn at that point.
And I love that you said how we react to the question, Selena, because I think for a lot of us, it's pretty common to maybe freak out a little bit when we're asked kind of a question that might be a little more than we were expecting. But we want to be cautious not to create shame around the topic of sexuality for our children, but to create comfort and normalcy, because we're all sexual beings. We all, we all will engage in those behaviors, hopefully in healthy and appropriate relationships. It is a very fulfilling piece of life. And so we don't want to create shame and difficulties for our children surrounding that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we want to think about what our goal is for our kids. And our long-term goal is to have a long, healthy, fulfilling relationship with everything that entails, including sexuality. And so that's what we want for our children. And I can share my experience and be vulnerable. I learned it all on the internet. Not a good place. I'm not recommending this. So don't do that. But when I was 19, when I got engaged, I was not comfortable talking to my parents. And so I Googled what I needed to know about all of this. And, that was just the situation I was in. And so I'm really hoping that my kids won't, have to go through that. And so one thing that I think can also be important is as they get old enough is to explain them about the opposite sex's sexual maturation process, right? So, I think that boys should have a basic understanding of how the menstrual cycle works. Girls should have a basic understanding of how an erection happens, and even that sometimes for boys, it happens whether they want to or not. And that way they can be sympathetic rather than mocking when something like that happens at school. Because the last thing you want is for your boy to be the kid that's laughing and pointing at the girl who started her period unexpectedly. And it's obvious, right? Or you would hope that your boy would be that one that would grab his sweater, say, hey, wrap this around your waist so you can go take care of, what's going on, or go to the nurse. So, those are other really great conversations to have as kids get old enough and as kids can understand what's going on.
That's really awesome. And that's really important to be aware. And I think sometimes we make it too complicated. And if we realize and kind of just sit back, it just kind of fascinates me. Like, we all started with sex. So this is normal and natural. I feel like sexuality is God-given. Our bodies were created to experience pleasure. We wouldn't be eating a dinner that is like our favorite dinner and be like, oh, we need to make this go away. It tastes too good. I enjoy this too much, right? And even as adults, that's something that we should be enjoying and experiencing in our life. We're sexual beings. And I believe that sexuality begins at birth. It's not a puberty or marriage. That when we are young, I think most of us have experienced that, have children, that our kids are going to grab their genitals, right? And it's like, that feels good. Feels good to them, and they're trying to figure it out, and they're curious. And that's really normal for them to experience that. And so teaching, like you already pointed out, for themselves or others, the body acceptance and making it normal, and that, we're given these sexual desires and we should be excited that that's part of our life. But when we have that knowledge and that experience of being comfortable talking about it and being comfortable with our body, I think it helps our teenagers to be educated so that they can make those choices at that point in their life of what are they going to do with that desire? What are they going to use that for? And how are they going to experience that for them in their life? Instead of this shame or I don't want to talk about it or just push it away, they can make those choices more educated when they understand what they're experiencing.
Okay, let's take a quick break and we will be right back.
What's up, everyone? Steve here with the Balance of Gray podcast. It's a brand new podcast.
That's good news.
Funny news stories, serious topics, and spiritual growth.
Phenomenon is what it is.
I can promise this won't be quite like anything you've heard before in a Christian podcast. The Balance of Gray brings raw discussions that get to the root of some of the hardest questions. In every few episodes, we feature inspiring testimonies from those who have walked the walk. There's already a good lineup of episodes for you to dive into, so go check them out and tune in on Wednesdays for a great time and a bold twist on igniting your faith. You can find the Balance of Grace podcast on nearly every listening platform out there. Start listening now.
Pretty good, huh?
Yeah, and I think the biggest piece is an educated or an informed decision. So, making sure they understand, like, they're not pressured into the situation, or, and again, that kind of comes back to values. Like, you want to teach your kids values. And I think another thing that would probably be good to talk about is this delicate balance in religious cultures of, a lot of times religions teach abstinence before marriage. And so you can kind of get into this tricky situation of, how do you talk to your kids about your values, convey your values, while also helping to protect them? Because if they are in a situation where, you've taught them, okay, I need to wait until I'm married to have sex, but if they are sexually active, we don't want them getting STDs or pregnancy, right? Or an STI. So tell me your guys' thoughts on this, on having these, appropriate conversations of being able to both pass down your values and also properly educating your kids.
Yeah, and that can be a tricky one, like you said, Liz. It is pretty difficult, and it's one of those things where, again, you really have to know what your family needs and where your beliefs lie. Certainly, even if you have, beliefs like such that Selena and I have, that we should wait until we're married to be sexually active, you might have a child that is, and there may come a time where you're like, you know what, we need to get you on birth control, or make sure that we've taught you about how to protect yourself and how to make good decisions and what healthy sexual relationships look like. I think we like to blame religion for this abstinence idea, but the reality is the research supports, a single partner relationship is a healthy direction to go. And it's not just religion. And I know we may get some hate from that, and that's fine too. You've got to do what you feel is best as an individual and for your family. But as we teach our children and we teach them healthy relationships, even that alone does help reduce the risk. It doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces the risk. And that's what the research shows, is that as we have these open and direct conversations with our children, it decreases their curiosity and their promiscuity, and they're more likely to wait to engage in those types of behaviors, less likely to engage in risky sexual behaviors. And so that's what we want. But there's nothing wrong with teaching your children how to be safe. And that goes all the way from, using protection like condoms and things like that, if you're going to be more risky, to birth control, to consent and understanding what that means and how that works, because it can be pretty tricky in the dating world when it comes to the topic of sex and sexuality.
Also, going back to connection, if you're in those situations, I think if you are having a relationship with your child, maybe even beyond these conversations and situations, you're going to, again, have those opportunities to know what's best for them and have those teaching opportunities to be more of that mentor to them, of educating them and protecting them and teaching them those ideas. I think when it comes to talking about sexuality, we can either be proactive or reactive. So we have the opportunity in our life that we can wait till situations come up and then we can react to them, right? Or we can take those steps now, uncomfortable or not, to find those opportunities that we can to be proactive into teaching our kids, so that when situations come up, they have that knowledge, they know who to come to, they're comfortable talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about encouraging curiosity without shame. And I know we've kind of touched briefly on it, of, making sure we've developed a healthy relationship with the kid and we're connected with them and we've had open dialogues in the past. So how do we encourage them to be curious about sexuality? Because I think that would be a good thing. What are your thoughts on this?
They already are curious. We actually don't need to encourage it. Really, it's going to happen. And it just comes back to the way we respond, right?
Mm-hmm.
If our children are allowed to be curious with us from a young age, when they say, how are babies made? And we're like, oh yeah, let me tell you. It's really an amazing process. And this is what happens. And we're excited about it. That invites continued curiosity in a healthy way, right? Because I promise you, your kids are curious about it. Even at a young age, well into elementary school, like we're not even talking junior high, like they're curious about it. They're learning about it from their friends. Their friends are saying things. Usually it's pretty inaccurate, but they're very curious about it. And so if we develop these relationships with our children that allow them to be curious without shaming them, there's a big difference when your kid comes to you and says, hey dad, how are babies made? And you're like, oh my gosh, no, we can't talk about that.
Yeah.
That you're way too young to worry about that. Now they're embarrassed and they're ashamed that they've thought about that. I'm bad. I shouldn't have done that. Versus, oh man, yeah, it is such an amazing thing. I'm glad you asked me about that. Let's chat about it for a minute. Right. And so just normalizing this whole idea certainly opens up the avenues for them to be curious with you instead of curious with Google.
Yeah. And not that Google can't be a good resource, because I've done that before. I have Googled, and obviously I do this when my kids are not like watching me on my phone, but I've Googled female anatomy or male anatomy, and I found something that gave me the information I wanted. And I've said, okay, look, this is how, and I've labeled all of the parts correctly for them. And then I've done the same thing with male anatomy, with male and female anatomy. So it's not this huge surprise for them that, this is what all the parts are and this is how they're labeled. And then, it's just, it's not a big deal. And it's just a normal thing that we can talk about. And that's easy to talk about, but maybe don't Google it while your kids are watching you, because you never know what's going to pop up.
Well, yes. And I think bigger than that, we don't want our children trying to navigate Google because they don't understand the terms that they should be searching for. And they don't there's a big difference between a mom and a dad that Google something for their own understanding to make sure they're clear before they teach versus, last time I asked my parents about this, it made me feel like I'm an idiot. So, I'm just going to go to Google because I wonder what happens, in this scenario or with XYZ. And so that's where Google becomes dangerous for kids. And we usually end up on some sort of porn site and not going a direction that is healthy and helpful at all.
And that's the last thing we want is children on porn, because there is a lot of research out there that has shown it is just not healthy for kids to be exposed to porn in any way. And unfortunately they are at a young age. That's another important part of sexuality, is hopefully you've had that talk with them that, hey, porn is really easy to access. It is not an accurate depiction of what sex is really like. And it's certainly not an accurate depiction of healthy sexuality.
Correct.
Okay, so conclusions, final thoughts, and final takeaways.
I want to just end with, you don't have to have all the answers. What matters most is being present and approachable. It's all in the way that you react and asking questions and understanding where they're at to help them with what they need.
Yeah. And I'll just end with, and we've already alluded to this or maybe even talked about it, but even if your kid's 16 and you haven't had any conversations with them, it's okay. Everything will be all right. Start those conversations and begin that process, develop the connections, and everything will be okay. You can do it.
Yeah. I'm going to end with a funny story because my 5-year-old said something that was hilarious. So we had just got done with the food therapy. And so he was talking about seeds and he's like, Mom, can you eat seeds? And I'm like, yeah, sure. We can eat some seeds. And he's like, no, I want you to eat the seed that will grow in your tummy that will make you have a baby. And so my immediate reaction was to laugh at him, which is not the right reaction, but I mean, it was funny, but it was just, again, it was one of those really great ways to have an organic conversation of, well, that's not quite how it works. And then, you can laugh about it later, but just look for organic ways and natural ways to have those conversations with your kids. And yes, kids say and do hilarious things. That would be another really good episode, is really funny things that kids have done.
I agree.
I love it.
Yeah. Okay. However, next week we are going to discuss the effects of divorce on kids. This isn't one that it's not one that I've talked about in a long time, but it's an important one because sometimes, well, because divorce, it just happens. So we're going to talk about that and how we can help kids through that and all the things. So we will see you all next week. Have a question? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com.